Hello, class. This is Dr. Todd Hardin. Welcome back to Congregational Conflict at Johnson University. In this brief video, we're going to continue in our studies of Scazzero's book, Peter Scazzero's book, The Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And the title of this lecture is called Letting Go of Power and Control. Well, by way of introduction, we have to remember that the Christian life is a journey. It's not just a destination. And if you don't know where you're headed, you'll end up walking in circles or staying still or walking in the wrong direction. And if you're walking in the wrong direction, walking in circles or staying still, you will not be able to help other people in your congregation navigate the inevitable conflict associated with fallen people living in a fallen world. You see, we've talked about this before, but I want to reiterate it here, and then we'll expand on it a little bit. But there can be no spiritual maturity apart from emotional maturity. And allowing God to direct your life is an important aspect of this spiritual maturity. And therefore, allowing God to direct your life is also an important part of your emotional maturity. And when I say emotional maturity, let me give you some examples. This is from a website, a secular website, but it lists, I think, 12 characteristics of an emotionally mature person or of emotional maturity. There's a flexibility. There's an ability to take personal responsibility. There's this idea that vision triumphs knowledge. In other words, you don't have to have all the answers. There's an aspect of personal growth. There's this aspect where you can seek alternative views because you're comfortable with who you are, and you don't need to not only to know everything, but your way is not the only way. And there's a maturity level there that doesn't get too upset when alternative views are presented. Emotionally mature people tend to be more non-judgmental. They tend to be able to be more resilient, whereas they can overcome difficulties more easily than emotionally immature people. They tend to be calmer, and they tend to be more realistic about their own limitations. They also are more approachable. They believe in themselves. In other words, they have a good self-image, a good soul image, and they can use humor in navigating the seemingly endless tribulations that we encounter going through life. So those are, and this is a totally secular website or web resource there, but I think it really points to some truth there, because all of those characteristics, if you think about it, could be applied to spiritually mature people as well. And so we're going to kind of use that connection between emotional and spiritual maturity throughout the course. But I wanted you to kind of see that even from a secular perspective, what emotional maturity looks like, what I'm talking about with emotional maturity. And I think it doesn't take a lot of effort to look down this list and get a pretty good feel for the connections between spiritual maturity. Now, with that said, Scazzero presents in his book a chart called Stages of Change. Now, this is not anything really new. I do think that Scazzero has some pretty interesting ways in the book that he unfolds it, but this has been going way back. I remember early Catholic fathers having some stuff, but it's an idea of spiritual development continuum or a cycle that we go through. But in Scazzero's model, we'll start at the top where it says new believer. Go back in your own spiritual journey. Think about when you first came to Christ, when you first started feeling that newness of life, if you will. It was really an exciting time. Things went from black and white to technicolor. And you were hungry to learn more about this faith that you had acquired. And so you move into this stage where it's all about discipleship. It's all about gaining knowledge. And as you gain knowledge, those folks in the church see that you're an up-and-comer, and you start ministering in everything your church offers usually. And that's more of a doing. There's this active life. But what ends up happening is you learn abruptly that you have limitations. and you'll hit what Scazzero calls the wall. You're overcommitted and under-resourced, if you will, or underpowered. And it's because you're seeking God's favor in somewhat, frankly, of a legalistic stage. I'll do it, and therefore He will love me. And it focuses on what you can do for the Lord, almost like you're very much a Martha in the Mary and Martha story. And you'll hit a wall because eventually you have limitations. You are not infinite. You are a mere mortal, and you'll find this out, and it's usually a pretty devastating time in your walk. What it forces you to do, though, by God's grace, for those that will continue to grow, is to push through that by looking inwardly and really understanding more about yourself and what's going on in your heart. I've mentioned this in prior lectures before, but Calvin said that true and sound wisdom consists of knowledge of God and knowledge of self. And the two are so intertwined that it's hard to tell where one begins and the other ends. And this inward journey is a moment or a time period, a phase in your life where there's a lot of reflectivity going on, a lot of contemplation, a lot of thinking through how you got to where you did, who you are, who God is, how He wants you to serve Him. And as you come through that, I think John of the Cross would call it that dark night of the soul, what happens is inside the Holy Spirit's doing a work, and you're yielding to the Spirit, and over a period of time, you become more and more and more deeply indwelt into Christ, your connection with Christ. I'm the vine, you're the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, apart from me you can do nothing. You'll feel a deeper connection with the vine of Christ. And as His love and the Holy Spirit flows through your veins, what ends up happening is it will pour out of you onto other people. And you'll start to share, and you'll start to recognize your limitations, but realize that apart from Him, you can do nothing in the first place. And so there will be a peace about it and a humility, and it will lead to deeper and deeper transformation, which is a closer and closer connection to Christ. And the emphasis is then, look, I still obey God's law, but I don't do it to earn His love. I do it because I want to, because I love Him and He loves me. And so that's what we're talking about with Scazzero's model of change. It goes from doing to being, and it's very, very worthwhile to understand this table here. Okay, well, why can't we rush through that cycle quickly? Well, there are obstacles that get in our way of our growth. And they're nothing fancy. There aren't a lot of psychological labels necessarily. They're just normal realities of the human experience, part of our own fallenness that gets in the way. And number one would be pride. There's a lack of awareness that you have any problems or need any help. Those that don't need help are not going to ask for it. And even if they do need help, if they don't know it, they don't know to ask. And they'll come across very off-putting, but why should you grow if you deny the fact that there's anything wrong with you? Even if you deny the fact that you've hit the wall, which happens often, and then people act out in really bizarre ways sometimes. And that's where you read these stories of a pastor did this or a church leader did that. They're leading double lives and stuff. It's because they're totally blinded to their own sin. Remember, our sinful hearts make us self-deceived. Hebrews 3:13 talks about that. And we can get carried away with it. So pride is a huge obstacle to our spiritual growth. In addition to pride, there could just be avarice. Loving things in this world more than you love Jesus. Yeah, but you don't understand. I've got this, this, and this, and I can't do that. Well, when you listen to that, you realize those decisions were made on things you were worshiping before. And moving back to Christ is what you have to do if you want to grow. But avarice will get in the way. One must count the cost to deepening discipleship, and often we're not willing to pay it. Number 3, luxury. I remember several years ago, it's not been several, it's been a few, talking about persecution in a discipleship training class at our church I was teaching. And I mean, we live in the most luxurious country in the history of the entire world. I mean, think about it. If our air conditioner goes out, we lose our minds. If the cable is down or the internet is out, we go crazy. And that's because we're spoiled. And sometimes we don't want to give up nice things in life to follow Christ. And that can be an obstacle to our spiritual growth. In addition to that, we may struggle with anger. We may want things our way, and we may have learned early on that there's one way to get it, and that's by bullying others. And that will keep us from listening to other perspectives. That will keep us from deepening. That will keep us from even questioning our own motives and heart because we know we're right. And so wrath can be another obstacle. A 5th obstacle could be spiritual gluttony. Maybe we spend 167 of the available 168 hours a week at church doing churchy things. And maybe we're convinced that the more we do, the better we are. And it may actually help us. When I say help, let me put that in quotes for you. It may help us feel better about ourselves. Oh, look, if he keeps doing this, he'll be a deacon one day. Those kind of things. And so we need to make sure that we're not practicing spiritual gluttony. Number 6, could be spiritual envy. Well, God blessed him or God blessed her. I want that blessing. And you will be so focused on what someone else has, you'll neglect your own walk and your own deepening with Christ. And finally, and this is the terrible one, sometimes we're just lazy. If you think about Bible reading, I don't want to get legalistic about it, but most folks at the turn of the new year start through, once again, I'm going to read the Bible through in a year. Now, there's nothing magical about reading the Bible through in a year. But the truth is, they've timed it. Experts have timed it. And it takes 72 hours to read through the entire Bible cover to cover. Now, it seems to me that 168 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, whatever the math is on that, somewhere in that we could find 72 hours to allow God to pour into us just by simply reading the text, but we don't. And so sloth often gets in the way of us growing spiritually and working through that cycle. Well, how do we find our way through that wall that we're going to hit? It's inevitable. You will hit it. When you're moving from doing to being, you will hit the wall. How do we go through that? Well, I like to use this thought process. One that I just came across as I was reading through the scriptures, Jesus' experience in the Garden of Gethsemane. Not that Jesus was thinking these things, not that Jesus was thinking to himself, here's a psychological concept that I can experience this and then share it with others through the Gospels, and then therefore Dr. Hardin in the 21st century can come up with this. But I do see some parallels here that I think are interesting. And since we are to be like Christ, I think it's important that we sort of follow his lead in things. And so there's a 3-step process whenever you run into the wall, that if you'll continually engage in this process over a period of time, you will find yourself moving closer and closer and closer into communion with Christ and through that wall onto the other side. And the first step, there are 3 R's. So the first step is to recognize. And that's really paying attention when something comes along your environment that you pick up with your senses that seems to be a draining or a very difficult situation. You need to recognize that. You need to call attention to that in your mind. Christ is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says, that he was grieved unto the point of death. Well, that takes some self-awareness. He didn't deny it. He was consciously aware that something was going on inside of him that wasn't sitting right. Likewise, you're in the same situation. Things come at you all the time, congregational conflict, difficulties in situations you face. And you've got to be able to own those, which means you've got to be able to connect this feeling of unsettledness, these negative emotional experiences, with the situation at hand. So you've got to be able to recognize it, call it into awareness, pay attention that something doesn't seem to be right. If you're talking with someone and you feel like you're being attacked, if you reach down and put your fingers on your wrist and you realize your pulse has gone up 15 beats from its normal resting pulse, chances are something's going on. So the idea, I'm not saying to do that, but the idea is to recognize when there's been a change in mood state, a change in emotional experience in light of news, a situation, another person, because that's the first step in learning to work through and deepen your union with Christ and getting through such a troubling, turbulent episode. So after we recognize, we need to regulate, and we do that through language. I don't have time to go into it in this video, but there's some things that go on in our brains even where we move some things out of our limbic system through the prefrontal cortex into our upper brain, which helps us make sense of our situation, and often that is carried along through language. Now, the best language you can use, frankly, is prayer. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's grieved to the point of death. And what does he do? He prays. He verbally prays to the Father. And so we need to verbally pray to the Father, but we also need to talk about our experiences to those in the church, if you will, to a trusted friend, a trusted loved one, so that we can help make sense of our experiences. So we can put a coherent narrative to what's going on with us in such a way that will bring calming. And so after we recognize, then we regulate through language, specifically prayer. Then God calls us to respond. In the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but your will be done, Father. And so after we regulate what's going on with us, we need to then respond back. So we recognize, regulate, and respond. Well, what does life look like on the other side? Well, now remember, this is still fallen people living in a fallen world, but by God's grace, they're growing progressively from one degree of glory to another into the likeness of Jesus. So I don't want to give you the impression that once you do this once or twice, everything's okay. It's not. But you'll experience a progressively deepening connection with Christ. And what you'll notice is you'll look back after a period of time and you'll realize you're somehow different qualitatively inside your heart. And one way you'll be different, Scazzero brings these up in his chapter, is that there's a greater level of brokenness. You know where all the bodies are buried in your heart. There's an intimacy with God that allows you to just be honest and transparent with Him and with yourself. So there's a greater level of brokenness. You know those limitations. There's also a greater, Scazzero puts it this way, a greater appreciation for holy unknowing or mystery. Job never did figure out why God did what he did. But in the end, because it was God who responded to him, that was enough. And so, as you grow in a deeper and deeper union with Christ and become more spiritually mature and go through the cycle that Scazzero talks about, you will develop an okay attitude toward not having to know all the answers. Because fear gets replaced with love and trust in God. There's also a deeper ability to wait for God. One of the most difficult things that young people struggle with is delayed gratification. They want what they want and they want it now. I think about young people just getting married. They've got their first jobs and life is out in front of them, and they end up going and buying a huge house and new cars and a boat for the lake. And what they're doing is they want to have the life mom and dad, one of them's mom and dad had. The difference is mom and dad spent 40 years saving, pinching pennies, putting kids through school, and now they have time. They didn't have it when they were 21, 22 years of age. And as you get wiser and grow in your faith and your union with Christ deepens, you'll develop a patience that wasn't there before to wait on God and His answers. There's also a greater detachment from the things of this world. That doesn't mean that you're so heavenly minded you're no earthly good. What it means is, though, is that there is a sense in which you see things more from God's perspective. You back things away that were too close to read before so that you can see them. And you can interpret things more clearly, and you can interpret things through a lens that matches God's more correctly. So those are some of the differences that once you break through that wall. Now, as far as the summary goes, first thing, we must remember that the Christian life is a journey, not just a destination. Do not lose sight of that. It's a journey and not just a destination. We also must focus on being instead of just doing. It's not what you do, it's who you are. And most importantly, it's whose you are. We must become increasingly aware of our internal experience when faced with these difficult situations that are inevitable. And we must follow Jesus' example of good emotional health by recognizing, regulating, and responding. Well, I hope that this lecture has been helpful, and I want to encourage you and remind you that you will be taking an exam on Sakai based on this lecture and the one following it. It will be only open for a limited period of time because this is going to take the place of class, and if you miss it, you're not going to be able to make it up. And these tests that will be with this lesson and the next one are 2.5% of your grade. So God bless. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or call me or just catch me after class or before class. God bless you.